I'm very delighted and pleased to be here for this 7th annual FSI International Center for Nonviolent Conflict Summer Institute on Advanced Nonviolence. And I would greet all of you and tell you how much I appreciate your willingness to be here for it, to explore with us this possibility that in the 20th century there has emerged a social science of social change, of political change, that the earth desperately needs. The historians have not caught up with the way changes have taken place in the 20th century or the 21st century through nonviolent struggle. In the institutions where I have taught the last 10 years, the political science departments, the public policy departments in some of our fine universities have not yet made a study of these movements, people's movements in Europe or Africa or Asia, Latin America, or the United States, a legitimate source of study and provocation, and have especially not understood that many of us across the earth who have been involved in these movements are convinced that the earth and the public policy makers and shapers of the earth have not in the 21st century indicated that their willingness to resolve the issues of abject social oppression, of violence and war, of the people of the earth having security. Most of all, they are not seemingly wanting to solve the issue of what it means to be a human being, what it means to be alive. What it means to live with, if it's just a tiny bit of the enormous energy and creativity of life that is in each one of us. So I'm delighted to be here and to join with you in this effort. I want to give thanks to Jack Duvall and Peter Ackerman for the work they've done across the last 15 or 20 or 30 years to make this happen, to make the center happen. I think there's no more important task for us human beings than try to help the human race move to a transition from that of thinking that domination and control and violence are the effective things for the future, and recognizing only our human resources, only our human beings are sufficient for the future, a kind of future that every baby can rejoice in anywhere in the world. I thank Jack and Peter also for this remarkable document, the A Force More Powerful. It is the finest book I have met yet on nonviolence, in part because I have a sociology background, and I learned in sociology that you have to figure out how you describe your situation with some degree of accuracy and comprehension. That if you can describe your own situation, you have a better chance of understanding it, a better chance of moving it to where you want it to be. So, this is the best document. How I wish I had this document in 1958 or 1963, because it does so much better than I have done, I think, in terms of convincing people that there is a distinctive methodology, theory, and history of people across many, many, many centuries who were able to use their deepest and most profound values to resist wrong, to correct issues, to challenge the powers that be. And if you haven't read the book, I hope that you will make the book a part of your library and that you will review and review and review it. Since its publication, I've used it as a textbook, one of my textbooks at Vanderbilt, at Harvard, at University of California, Los Angeles, and a variety of places in between. So I commend it to you, and we have to applaud. In future, I think people will acknowledge that that book has been a very pivotal instrument for helping us to become more aware of the power of nonviolence. I want this evening to very, very briefly do a kind of a summary statement. I think this film, the whole 6 segments of A Force More Powerful Than Video are excellent. I use them all persistently in the community, in churches, in university classes, and the rest of it. So I think the whole set is quite wonderful. I want to begin by trying to give you a context for what is called the civil rights movement, because it's not possible to understand this particular piece except within that broader context. The civil rights movement was perhaps the most significant and powerful movement of the people of America since perhaps 1730 or 40, when all over the 13 colonies that were the beginning of our land, men, women, black people, Indians, were examining the issues of freedom and equality and had major conversations about what the future of the country was or should be. And from that movement, which had its difficulties, the civil rights movement is a continuation of the drive of this people here to achieve a society where there is access for every boy and every girl everywhere across the land, and where the uses and purposes of government are not war and violence and profit, but where the purposes of government are wrapped up in the saying that I heard often in 1968 especially, that the business of government is the people. And I add the well-being, the nurturing, the cultivation. We of the human race have many, 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 many millions and billions, maybe even billions of light years to go before we understand ourselves and what it means to be a man or a woman. But the nations of the earth and the big businesses of the earth are so engaged in their agendas that they have no idea what is the agenda of the 7 billion people on earth today. And Gandhi said it very well when he insisted that the agenda of ordinary people is a vastly different thing from the agenda, and I'll use the term again, of the powers that be, of the structures of power. So that the CRM was that kind of a movement. And in my own study and research, I've recognized that there are more than 15 dimensions of that movement. Almost none of the 15 dimensions have really been examined or written about. You could have at least 15 volumes on the movement, with any number of other volumes that would have to cover pieces of each. In this film, you saw, for an example, the black lawyers of Nashville gathering together to shape strategies in the courtroom, strategies against the charges that were made against us. Well, the legal strategy was just one dimension of the movement. It's been largely understudied and researched. But the legal strategy that was worked on in 1930 by the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was that they were going to find lawyers and train lawyers to go after the laws, to go after the Constitution, to try to strip segregation of legal or constitutional wrappings. That's just one segment. What you saw here this evening is another segment, another facet of the struggle, and I call it the direct nonviolent action dimension. There are many illustrations of it across our history in the past, but it came to, in a way, a full bloom in the 50s and the 60s. And I'm going to quickly name the different pieces of it, the different campaigns of the direct action part of the movement. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, 57. In 1960 was this sit-in campaign, direct action, nonviolent direct action movement. To Martin Luther King has to be credited with the notion of having enough understanding of what he did in the bus boycott and what the people were about, that he floated the term, we are engaged in a non-violent action. So that brought the term alive as it had never been before in the United States. You may or may not know that the term itself was coined by Gandhi in India while he was in South Africa. He writes this in one of the books, of one of his many books. He coined the term because he wanted a different way of talking about the resistance movement that he was beginning to build in South Africa against the arrogance of the Boer and the British empires in that part of the continent. So the bus boycott, then 1960 was the sit-in campaign. 1961 was the Freedom Ride campaign. 1962 was the Albany, Georgia campaign. 1963 was the Birmingham campaign. 1964 was the Mississippi Summer, Freedom Summer. 1965 was the campaign of Selma to Montgomery, which produced legislation for change. 1966 was the campaign in Chicago of what they called their civil rights movement in that city. 1966 also was the 66 was the Meredith March Against Fear, 1967 was the 66, 67 was the Chicago campaign. 1968 was the sanitation strike in Memphis, of which I was the chairperson of the strategy committee. 1969 were a series of hospital strikes in the southeastern part of the country by public hospital workers to organize unions to eradicate the poverty of their jobs, the lack of safety of their jobs. I want to jump back, though, in 68 because I neglected to point out that in 1968, students on their own campuses decided to take issue with the curriculum and the policies of the university. So Howard University students in Washington, D.C. began their sit-in, their shutdown of the administration building. And that went on for another 10 or 15 years all across the United States. In fact, as a consequence of that movement, universities, for the most part, decided that they needed to have women's studies department and black studies department and Hispanic study departments. That became a normative way for universities to begin to help do their educational tasks for all their students. And as I say, that direct action, largely nonviolent demonstrations of various kinds went on for another 10 or 12 or 15 years. When I speak of the civil rights movement, I speak of at least a 20-year period in which there was major action and tens of thousands of minor actions from 1953 to 1973. One could easily use other dates, but it was a 20-year period. I want to press hard on the business that of the enormous energy, the millions of people, the small demonstrations, the sizable demonstrations, the wave of thought that moved across our country into what Martin Luther King called the coalition of conscience that made possible then basic laws, basic legislation, basic decisions on the part of the Supreme Court that, among other things, did this. It said that the Constitution included all the residents of our society, which did not happen in 1789, nor any time until the middle part in the 70s and 80s of the 20th century. The Constitution did not include women. The Constitution did not include decisions by the judiciary that excluded black people, that excluded Mexican Americans, that excluded the criminal, excluded the poor. So one of the historic achievements that in large measure we do not celebrate in the United States of that movement was, in fact, the lawyers who went to court on case after case, carried many of those cases to the Supreme Court, and got decisive decisions from the Supreme Court, almost always unanimous decisions that the purpose of the Constitution must be inclusive of all the people of our land. Now, what you see in the United States today is the reaction to the change. So we now have a Supreme Court again that is very much like the Supreme Court of 1896 that decided that the Negro had no rights that a white person needed to acknowledge. That's an actual decision of the Supreme Court of the United States in 1896. So the racism blossomed in the resistance, joined with political figures who were calling themselves conservative. So we now have a packed Supreme Court of 9 people that essentially is a court of 1896 and not a court of the year 2012, which is one of the factors that we did not acknowledge, namely the fact of our arousing a resistance that has become in the United States the best organized resistance movement in the world. Billions of dollars from our operation of the economy, billions of dollars at the disposal to convince the American people that certain people do not deserve human rights and do not have them. And so I want to just simply say to you that our country is obsessed with, but never talking about the fact that racism, sexism, violence, greed, or economic exploitation, what I sometimes call plantation capitalism, have offered many mental and intellectual poisons across our country, so that in many ways our battle here, in my judgment, is more intense, more convoluted than ever before, with not very much light being offered. This campaign in Nashville was the campaign that was the bridge between the Montgomery bus boycott and then the rest of the decade. We took in Nashville 6 months to determine that the issue was not school desegregation, the issue was not police brutality, the issue was not poverty. These were all issues we recognized, but we decided that psychologically, spiritually, morally, for the health of Nashville, to begin the process of desegregating the downtown area, which meant, of course, the whole city, pulling down the white-colored signs and so forth and so on as the film depicts. And as I then, but even now, I think that a nation like ours that had signs in restaurants and skating rinks and theaters and public buildings that had on them, "No Indian in here," "No WAP allowed," "No dirty Irish," "No Mexican," "No Jap," "No Jew." These signs were scattered all over the country. There was no major protest against them. By 1964 in the Civil Rights Bill, what the sit-in campaign then began in terms of a deliberate target. Eradicate the separate waiting rooms, these signs. The 1964 Civil Rights Bill then had as one of its pillars, one of its articles, that such signs are unconstitutional. Unwarranted. And while it took maybe 10 or 15 years for most of those signs across the country to come down, that job also is still incomplete. The other thing I want to lift up about this movement is that we spent a year in study and talk and conversation and building the community that we needed to make the campaign, the public campaign, work. And 4 months of that were spent in discipline, examining the experience of nonviolence, using not only the Montgomery bus boycott, but many, many illustrations from our own history, and talking about its history, examining what Gandhi said about methodology and approach and theory and power. And so we had a whole group of people in the community who were very much steeped in then at least the theory and practice of nonviolence. The other thing I want to say about the movement was that the movement here and then across the next decade engendered power. Nonviolence is a mixed understanding from my perspective. It has personal implications, but it has profound political and social implications because it creates a new form of power that usually the conventional society has not acknowledged. And it celebrates that power because I say that power comes from people, ordinary people. So that in the case of Nashville, we use the economic boycott, the mass meeting, the picketing, the sit-in campaign, the marches, as some of the weapons we used. That put into the Nashville scene a power for change that was not evident in any of the other levers of power in the city. And the net result that when we reached the point that the merchants were ready to negotiate, they did so not primarily because we had softened them up personally, though we also had that going on, but because they were in a bind where they would either make serious changes and thus a new course in the path of the city economically, or the power we had engendered would literally make it impossible for them to operate. So I insist that we want to understand that the use of power is a part of the whole thing that Gandhi recognized and that I insist is essential. I'm all for redemption and transformation of people, and I've seen a lot of that across the years. I'm all for the enemy taking a different vision of himself or herself and of his world. So I applauded Vanderbilt making the change that they could recognize me as a part of the alumnus of Vanderbilt. But I insist that while that is an important element, it is not the critical dynamic of nonviolence. Nonviolence creates a form of power unanticipated in the conflict and enables that power to be directed towards the kind of change that the nonviolent struggle and movement is trying to create. And a part of the way that that power is engendered is because it puts into the middle of the community, as it's said in the film very well, it puts a different agenda on the table. The conventional agenda is not the agenda that we needed to have faced, and so the mobilization of the community, of the people, helped to create the change, an agenda on the table. I want to say finally then that in that film, almost every action that is in the film was strategized by us beforehand. They were planned. I created a structure in Nashville that we called the Central Committee. And that Central Committee had 2 representatives from each of the campus, and then about 5 or 6 of us from the Nashville Christian Leadership Council on it. And we had to spend night and day, so I warn you, as most of you already know, when you get engaged in a serious struggle in your community, you expect to sleep little, work around the clock, and you have to find both the strength and the energy to think creatively and to think wisely in the midst of making it happen. The Central Committee planned every strategy. For an example, one of the things that we did in that movement was that I pretty much dictated the notion that no clergy person and no adult could chair the strategy committee, that it always had to be a student. And the Central Committee had accepted that. I also proscribed that when we had a press conference, there would always be a student that we would select, and then someone from the adult community. So you saw a scene there in the march where C.T. Vivian, who went on and is one of the wonderful, outstanding people of nonviolence in our country, and Diane Nash were selected at 6 o'clock in the morning to make our presentations to the mayor. So we had formed a structure for the campaign that went all out to create thinking and planning and examination of each move that we tried to make. And I would push you very hard at understanding that Gandhi's knowledge and experimentation with nonviolence included the business of creative strategy that helped to outfox and outrace the opposition powers. There's a wonderful example of this going on right now in the United States, and it's making me rethink some things about strategy and action. That's the DREAM Act students. You may or may not know that just 2 Fridays ago, the president announced a 2-year moratorium. There would be no, and giving maybe 2 million undocumented students in the United States, mostly from Central America, Mexico, and Latin America, but also from Asia and Africa, and even from Europe, a 2-year period where they can do their work and go to school without being deported. Various people in our country have been urging that executive order for 3 years. And always they were told, we do not have the power. When the DREAM Act students started organizing about 5 years ago, only about 5 years ago, and the base was in Los Angeles, and and at University of California, Los Angeles, undocumented students who began to research and organize. And against the wish of the immigration rights movement, they decided, even if we don't get the comprehensive reform, we're going to get changes made on our status. And so they defied their elders on this issue of our organizing, and they organized systematically. Now, the press hasn't reported the result of their strategizing for that executive order, because they've done other things. They've had conferences with the White House and even with the president. They've had hunger demonstrations in Miami and Los Angeles and elsewhere. They've had Miami group of students undocumented march from Miami to Washington a year and a half or 2 years ago. So they've had all these demonstrations. None of these demonstrations have been large, mostly relatively small. They keep strategizing. They strategized that we're going to go after this executive order, and they did it by carrying on a demonstration, first of all, in Denver at the Obama campaign headquarters. They did a sit-in. It put the Democratic Party in all sorts of fears. They were persistent. They were nonviolent. They sat in. They made it possible for the Democratic Party to consider, what are we going to do? They didn't want to arrest them. Should we call the police and arrest them? That was what some wanted to do. But what would that look like then for the Democratic Party and for the campaign? They did about 6 of these across the country, then moved to Washington, to the Obama re-election campaign headquarters, and did sit-ins. The Democratic Party was entirely alarmed at the upper levels. They insisted, we're going to keep on doing this. And the Democratic Party strategists then saw the practicality of writing that executive order. An order that, in my judgment, should have been written 3 years ago. Well, I'm saying to you, you see, that was power. And not large numbers in that case, but a great variety of activities. Remember now, this is a group of people in the United States who had no legal papers. And I've met any number of them on both coasts and in between. Some of them were brought by their parents with a valid visa. They came when they were 2 months old, or 3 years old. I met not 6 weeks ago a young man, Philip, a South Korean. His father came in on a visa and a job. Then the boss in the job and his father had a falling out, and he would not renew the contract, so he could not then renew the visa. The stories are they're not simple stories of illegality. They're human stories, often extremely complicated. They have no papers, but of course my thesis is that there is no such thing as an undocumented human being anywhere in the world in the sight of creation. There's no such thing as an illegal human being. I think creation may know better than we know what it's doing. Creation doesn't produce undocumented illegal people. It's nonsense for us human beings to adopt such ideas about one another. But here's an illustration of a relatively small group of people organizing, because it's tough. They can be picked up at any time, anywhere, as they work and go to school, graduated from high school, graduate from college, undercover. But it demonstrates there's still much that At least I think I can learn from strategizing and planning and how you put on a campaign. Well, the final point I want to make is that the movement that this film represents was a tremendous importance for changing the climate of our country and the structures of our country. But I would say finally to you, it's not done. The task is still complicated and still before us. The nation is more than ever before denying that it has lived for 400 years as a racist, sexist, violent people. And this is not to say that all of us are equally like that, but it is to say that our major structures have been destructive of millions of people in our land. So we still have that task to go on. But I'm persuaded that the issue is not activism or apathy. The issue is people discovering that there are, within the grasp of their hands, simple but complicated tools for social justice, for social equality, for social change, that if we can adopt it in the human family in many different places and ways, we can change the course of history from exploration and domination to the discovery of our common humanity and to the fact that these issues that divide us are issues that can be faced in a creative manner that can put them on the path towards solution. We do not have the kind of world that we human beings are capable of having. And there are, using religious language of my own, there are principalities and powers that do not care for a different world, trying to convince us that this is the best and this is the only world we can have. And I urge you to look at the implications of the history, the evidence of the peoples of the earth of the last 100 years, especially the last 110, 15 years, and recognize that millions and millions of people have discovered a power that if we use it together and discover how to use it best, we can put on the agenda of the human family the other world that is very possible. Thank you.